So we're still digesting a lot of the Rishi Sunak reshuffle here in the Sky News Westminster office. And you'd have been hard pushed to miss the level of change and churn in this government. I mean, you just need to look at the number of prime ministers. 5, Home Secretaries 7, including Suella Braverman twice. But one brief stands out above any other, and that's housing, because that department has had 16 ministers in 13 years. Now, the Prime Minister just sacked the last one, Rachel Maclean, who'd only been in the job for 9 months. And it's now over to Lee Rowley with a pretty challenging in-tray. Let's speak to Gurpreet Narwan, our political correspondent, on what might be some of his most pressing issues.
So housing is really one of those endemic issues that successive governments have just failed to get a grip of, even though there's a lot of talk about solving the problem. And as a consequence of that, we now have more than 131,000 children homeless in the UK living in temporary accommodation. There are 1.1 million households in England on a waiting list for social housing. But last year, just 7,500 social homes were built. And in the last year or so, it's become really difficult for renters because rising interest rates, landlords have been passing on rising interest rates to renters. And as a result of that, rents are soaring and no-fault evictions are up 38% in a year.
So when you're getting a new housing minister quite so often, just how much does that limit what you can get done, especially on a subject like this, which could be critical for winning over young voters? It's a huge subject we're digging into on the Sky News Daily podcast with me, Sally Lockwood. And we'll be speaking to one of the 16 former housing ministers, Lord Gavin Barwell, as well as the charity Shelter on tenants' rights. But first, let's get a bit more from Gurpreet. Now, when it comes to renting and people trying to get on the property ladder, I mean, we are one of those nations that has a lot of people still house sharing well into their 30s. What are the main issues for renters and would-be homeowners?
Well, it's supply of housing. That's the main problem in the UK. We just haven't built enough homes over the years to keep up with population growth in the cities and towns where those houses are needed. The current government had a long-standing target in place to build 300,000 homes a year by 2023. It's not even clear if that target still exists. It's going to be missed. But there's a lot of opposition from within government, MPs in constituencies with a green belt, with constituents who care about green spaces, often block or vote against measures that could improve the situation in the UK. And that's something Labour have seized on. At his conference speech in Liverpool, Keir Starmer talked about bulldozing through the planning regulations and getting Britain building again. But I think it's quite telling that in PMQs recently, after the by-election in Tamworth and Mid-Bedfordshire, Rishi Sunak, one of the first things he pointed out to Keir Starmer was that the 2 MPs that have been elected have actually not been so clear on their position on house building because they don't want to upset people in their constituencies who care about green spaces. So this is all about kind of the stake that we have as individuals as well and how we vote. And that's being reflected upwards in terms of how MPs are acting at a national level.
What insight do you have there? Why have there been so many housing ministers in the last 2 years?
It's really interesting because following the latest departure, Michael Gove and Kemi Badenoch have been really critical of it. They didn't want her to lose her job.
Rachel Maclean.
They didn't want Rachel Maclean to lose her job.
Yeah.
She was sacked yesterday as housing minister. We don't really know why she was sacked. There's some speculation that, it's because she's not polished or as media savvy or as good, good on the kind of broadcast round as other ministers are. But she had the backing of Michael Gove. And if you listen to kind of when Michael Gove's been asked about how frustrating is it trying to push through legislation, the Renters Reform Bill, when his housing ministers keep being sacked, he says it's just simply not ideal. Effectively, this isn't just an issue with the housing department. It's what happens when you have a party in government that's in crisis. And a lot of former cabinet ministers have really spoken about this as a problem. If you remember Chris Grayling, who was one of those long-standing cabinet ministers under David Cameron and then Theresa May, he was Justice Secretary and Transport Secretary. He held those positions for about 3 years, which in the current climate seems like a pretty long time. And afterwards he said, I just didn't have enough time. Even 3 years wasn't enough for me to push through the kind of reforms that were required. And I don't need to tell you why having experience is important for your job and can make you better at your job. But it allows you to, really understand your brief, to build relationships with civil servants, to understand the subject area that you're meant to be leading. And I think there is a real belief among former cabinet ministers, who have spoken about it openly since, that the lack of kind of longevity in these positions is affecting their ability to do their jobs properly.
Now, one of the 16 was Lord Gavin Barwell, who was housing minister for just a year from July 2016. He then, of course, went on to be chief of staff for Theresa May when she was Prime Minister. There's been a lot of churn in the Tory party in the last few years when it comes to Prime Ministers, Chancellors, Home Secretaries. But the housing brief has had 16 ministers. What's going on?
It's very bad for public policy to have that level of churn, first of all. It's highly undesirable because you don't get the stability that you want if you want to encourage business to invest in housing in this country. I think that the reasons for it are twofold. One, you kind of alluded to, which is there's just been a lot of churn generally over the last 4 or 5 years because of all the issues in our politics post the Brexit referendum. But the housing job is particularly vulnerable to it. And I think that's because of the seniority of the job. So if you think about some of our other great public services, education or health, you have a cabinet level minister who is responsible for them. But you don't have that for housing. Housing is part of the department, what's now known as the Department for Levelling Up Housing and Communities. So that you get the Secretary of State for Levelling Up Housing and Communities, that's Michael Gove at the moment. And then you have a Minister of State level job, that's a kind of level 2 job, who's the Minister for Housing. There are kind of 3 grades of ministerial roles. And that Minister of State for Housing job is seen, I think, by Prime Ministers as one of the most senior of those level 2 roles. So they tend to put into it people who they think are likely to come into the cabinet at some point in the future. And then the moment there's somebody resigned, there's a scandal or something, someone has to leave the cabinet, they quickly then get sort of vaulted upwards. So if I think about the people that did the job after me, you had Alok Sharma and Dominic Raab and Kit Malthouse. All of those people quickly went on to be in the cabinet.
The reason we've chosen to talk about this today is because housing is such a huge issue for so many people in the UK, especially young people. And we're not talking people in their 20s, we're talking people under the age of 40 who are still in house shares. It's a really big issue. Is the Tory government neglecting something that could be a huge vote winner here?
I think that governments of all colours for the last 30 or 40 years haven't given housing the priority it deserves. I mean, the reason we've got this crisis is for a very long period of time, we've not built the number of homes we need to meet the demand for housing. That's why prices have gone up so much and why so many people now struggle to afford a home in the area in which they want to live. And, when I was housing minister, along with Saj Javid, who was the Secretary of State at the time, we made a concerted effort to get the numbers up. And they came in the year or two after that, they came close. For the only time in the last 30 or 40 years, they got close to getting up to 300,000, which is probably the level we need. And then the numbers have fallen back recently. And, Rishi Sunak's government has weakened planning policies, stopped requiring local authorities to release enough land in their areas to meet housing needs. So we've gone backwards a little bit, I'm afraid, in the last couple of years.
So the new housing minister, as of yesterday, is Lee Rowley.
Yep.
What should his priorities be? And realistically, what can he hope to achieve in the space of what may be just a year before the next election?
We need to get a cross-party consensus on the importance of building more homes in this country and the different things we need to do in order to enable that to happen. There's not a single answer. And so I would suggest there's got to be at least 4 or 5 things that we need to look at. We need to look at the planning system and making sure that we're releasing enough land for housing, and also that we've got enough capacity in the planning system to process applications quickly, to speed up the process from once you've got land to being able to start to build the homes. But we also need more people to get involved in building those homes. We don't have enough house builders. If you look at the current companies, even if the economy was doing much better than it's doing, they won't produce the numbers of homes that we need. We also need to build more council and housing association housing, affordable housing for people that can't afford market housing. And then finally, I'd say we need to look at the local politics of housing. At the moment, if you were the leader of a local council and you're proposing to release more land for housing, it's almost certainly a vote loser, because the people who are going to benefit from those homes may not even live in the area at the moment. But some of the people who do live there will not like the idea of land being built on. And so government needs to think of ways in which it can connect funding for better public transport or new schools or improvements to the local hospital to the political decisions to build more housing, so that local politicians get some kind of reward when they try and do the right thing and build the homes that this country so desperately needs.
Now, you made a very good point bringing up the issue of social housing. And just for the sake of transparency, it is worth saying that you are on the board of the Clarion Housing Group, which is Europe's largest housing association.
You're right, yes.
Now, Gavin, Clarion's not been without its scandals in terms of the state of some of Britain's social housing. How much more attention needs to go into the conditions in social housing? You know, various scandals have revealed it's been absolutely appalling in so many circumstances.
So you're absolutely right. We haven't just got a supply crisis where we don't have enough homes, but we also need a greater focus on the quality of the homes that we do have, particularly in both the private rented sector and the social housing sector. And, you know, at Clarion, we've recognised that we haven't got everything right. We're absolutely committed to providing the best quality homes to all of our residents. We're significantly increasing the investment that we're putting into our homes. We've then got a third related challenge, which is, you know, with net zero in mind, we need to decarbonise our housing stock. So we need to significantly improve the energy performance of those homes and change over time how they're heated. And that's, at Clarion, that's our obligation in terms of the over 100,000 homes we have in this country. But the same is true for every local council and housing association and for private sector landlords as well.
How do we fare compared to other countries in Europe when it comes to the cost of private rental and also the state of social housing?
So I think we're pretty poor on affordability, whether you're talking about affordability of homes to rent in the private rented sector or whether you're talking about affordability of homes to buy. We don't compare well. And it's not a uniform national picture. You know, the people listening to your programme, it'll vary a lot around the country. London and some of our other main cities, you've got a very high affordability ratio in terms of, you know, what's the average income people have got compared with what the average home costs to buy. There are other parts of the country where the ratio is much better and housing is reasonably affordable.
Do you think Labour will do a better job with housing if they win the next election?
So I hope that a Labour government will make some of the improvements that I've talked about. You know, if you listen to what they're saying at the moment, they at least recognise some of these problems. And I hope that my colleagues in the Conservative Party, when they're thinking about their manifesto, will give higher priority to housing. There's a quite intense debate going on within the Conservative Party between those who you might characterise as sort of NIMBYs, not in my backyard, and those who would share my passion that we need to do much better as a country in this area.
Gavin, thanks so much for your time. We're going to take a short break now, but when we come back, we'll be looking at just how hard it is to be a renter right now. So, as yet another housing minister bites the dust and a new one takes on the portfolio. That's the 7th in 2 years. Let's turn now to the scale of the UK housing problem and who exactly is being affected. Polly Neate is the CEO of the homeless charity Shelter. Polly, great to have you with us to talk about this really important subject. I just wanted to start by getting your take, if I may. 16 housing ministers in 13 years is obviously not a great statistic for any government. But crucially, what impact has it had?
I would like to think that the government would have taken a more urgent approach to what has to be done about the housing emergency if we hadn't had all of that chopping and changing. Having said that, you know, we do now have the Renters Reform Bill before Parliament right now. I was giving to the committee stage this morning. So what I'm hoping is that the change of minister won't get in the way of that. If it does, then I think that will be an obvious example of where this kind of change of people can cause a problem. We have had continuity at Secretary of State level for quite a while in Michael Gove, which I think is anyway a good thing. But, you know, I am concerned about the bill. I don't want to see any watering down of it.
With the bill you're referring to, Polly, just outline what it is.
So this is the Renters Reform Bill, which contains, for example, the move to end no-fault evictions, so Section 21 evictions. So anyone who's privately renting will know that at the moment you can be evicted for absolutely no reason. And one of the key things the bill will do is to eliminate those no-fault evictions so that landlords will have to give reasonable grounds for an eviction.
Just talk me through the latest on the situation when it comes to the cost of living crisis and how that is impacting people.
So we at Shelter have just done new research on private renting because we're bracing ourselves for a really serious crisis of evictions over the winter. Our new research shows that if you include children, 1.1 million people are at risk of losing their homes right now. And then 3.5 million tenants say that they're now worried about becoming homeless because of the cost of their housing. So the rents are spiralling absolutely out of control at the moment. So there's a cost of housing crisis. And then, of course, the cost of living crisis means that people's other expenses are going up as well. And so it's the combination of those two things, really, that are leading to an absolute landslide of evictions this winter.
Yeah, that is a real worrying prospect.
What we're finding is, you know, every single day, if you look at our emergency helpline, every single day our teams are taking more and more calls. But of course, at the same time, there's more and more calls that we can't answer.
In the last 13 years, have any of the 16 housing ministers done anything to impress you, or have any stood out in any way for you?
What has impressed me in the last few years from the current government is the social housing regulation bill. That was a really hard fought campaign on the part of Shelter in partnership with the survivors of the Grenfell fire. And that has now seen action. So the social housing regulation bill is now law, and that will improve conditions for people in existing social housing. It doesn't do anything about the dire shortage of social housing, but it definitely improves conditions. And as we saw from the tragic death of little Awab Ishaq, which I'm sure people will remember, poor housing conditions are really dangerous for people's health. So that has happened. I've already mentioned the Renters Reform Bill. You know, the government introduced that bill, all power to them. That is brilliant. This is going to get techie now, just to warn you, a bit nerdy. But the government ended something called hope value, which is about how land is valued. And what it will mean is that land values will come down when land is compulsorily purchased, which means that then developments are more likely to afford to build social housing. So it's a building block to what we need to see. What I would argue is that it has been glacially slow. And I think if we'd seen less change in those ministerial roles, we would have seen a much greater speed in terms of these like urgently needed reforms, because it takes a minister, this is fair enough, you know, it takes a while to get your head around the brief. Housing is relatively complex as well as a brief for a minister. So it does take a while to get your head around it. And then if you're immediately replaced with someone else, you lose that momentum, which is so important.
Given housing is such an important area for everyone who lives here, you know, given housing is so significant, should there be a Secretary of State specifically for that brief rather than it falling under another department?
That's a really interesting question. I mean, to me, it's more about the political will and the support from elsewhere in government to really to get a grip on the emergency that housing in this country has become. So I actually don't think the problem is at Secretary of State level. What I think the issue is, certainly with the current government, is that we need that commitment at number 10, we need commitment in the Treasury, and we need commitment in the wider parliamentary party to really get a grip on understanding how serious this issue is, the absolute abject misery and destitution that is causing, and then to take action on it.
Thanks, Polly, and thanks to you all for listening. That's it for today. Join us again tomorrow.